welcome to another week in Washington here at the National Right to Work headquarters. I'm Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee, and today I'm pleased to be joined by John Kalb, who is the vice president for state legislation. John's been with the committee here in Washington for 8 years, and he has been out running across the country doing right to work field work for a couple of state right to work groups for 8 years prior to that. So 16 years is what John accumulated in his service here to the right to work cause. And it's a real privilege to work with John as he monitors what's happening in state legislatures around the country. And so, John, as we kind of look at what's going on right now, we're in kind of the heat of the state legislative battles. I mean, most of the state legislators are operating now, not for the good of the country per se, but certainly they're out there operating, and you're following state legislation across the country. I mean, from a tracking standpoint, how many bills do you think the National Right to Work Committee State Legislation Department will track during a legislative session?
Well, thanks for the question, Mark. How many bills do we track? It runs into the thousands. I mean, really, every day, the two staff I have working on it will see 50 or 100 bills coming in from the various places around the country. Obviously, some days are bigger than others, and most of it's concentrated from about January to April because most state legislatures are seasonal. But yeah, we'll hit several thousand a year, and then we'll ultimately end up actually actively tracking several hundred of those and actually take action on a couple hundred every year.
Yeah. Well, that is a lot of work, John, and the fact that literally there's 100,000 bills or more introduced every legislative session around the country in these state legislatures is something we have to pay attention to, and it's good that your team is watching that. And as you mentioned, we will be taking action on a couple hundred bills in just about every state across the country. There's something that we're after or looking at. Let's talk specifically about right to work. I know that there's a lot of issues that deal with labor policy or with employment matters that are a little bit on the edge of the right to work issue, but let's talk about right to work and the right to work laws in the country. We've got a couple of states where we're watching in a defensive posture about what's happening as legislatures consider whether or not to maintain their status as a right to work state. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, obviously, Mark, we typically see some knucklehead introduce a right to work repeal bill in something like 8 or 10 right to work states. And in places like South Carolina, that's obviously not going to go anywhere. But in terms of places where we're having to watch a little more closely, obviously right now the two big ones are Virginia and Nevada. Virginia's legislative session ended recently with the right to work repeal bill dying in committee. So we're thankful to have that one safe for the year. I mean, obviously, we're going to need to continue lobbying Virginia legislators, through their elections this fall. They obviously have the off-year elections, unlike a number of other states. We'll need to keep lobbying them so that we can build some additional support so that we're not quite on the same kind of defensive footing as we've been. The other state where we have real defense to do is Nevada. Of course, they passed union monopoly bargaining for state employees a couple of years ago, and it's largely the same kind of legislative makeup. I mean, partisan makeup isn't a perfect indicator, but you have a Democrat governor and Democrat majorities in both houses of the legislature, and that's always something we have to watch. And so we're actively on the lookout for any noise at a right to work repeal. I mean, obviously last cycle the union bosses got their monopoly bargaining for state employees. And so, they're going to be demanding something additional. Nevada has no operative bill introduction deadline, so we're going to need to watch them, up until they adjourn on June 1st. It's going to continue to be something we just have to pay very close attention to.
Okay. Well, that's the defensive posture we're in, and that's not a surprise. We have to defend our right to work laws oftentimes, and we've done that successfully throughout our history. Let's talk about the good news. Let's talk about the chances to expand the right to work portfolio by passing a new right to work law in a new state. I mean, obviously we passed 5 new right to work laws in the last 9 years. That's a pretty progressive and aggressive trend when it comes to the history of the right to work movement. But talk about the possibility of adding another right to work state, perhaps maybe in New Hampshire?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Mark. I mean, obviously, New Hampshire this year is our best opportunity to pass a state right to work law. The New Hampshire Right to Work Bill, Senate Bill 61, passed the New Hampshire Senate several weeks ago by a 13-11 margin, and it at least has a fighting chance in the state house, with Governor Sununu having signaled in the past that he's willing to sign a right to work law that comes to his desk. So but the New Hampshire House is unfortunately very tightly split between the two parties, and we've had a history there of having a number of Republican state representatives go south on us. So we're going to have to watch it very closely. I mean, every cycle that we continue to run our programs, we lose fewer and fewer Republican legislators. That accelerated after the Janus decision that our Legal Defense Foundation won. But we still have hope, but we still are going to have to push, with everything we have, and work with the state Right to Work group up there to try and ensure that we don't lose any more votes than absolutely necessary, and hopefully pull it across the finish line this year. Obviously, going up against big labor's billions is never easy, but it's always nice when you have nearly 80% of the American people on your side.
Yeah, that certainly does help, John. And we've been up in New Hampshire for a lot of years, and we've come close. We've had the legislature and had a bad governor. We've had a governor and a bad legislature. We've had a good House and a bad Senate, and a good Senate and a bad House. And this is a 400-member chamber. I think it's the third largest legislative body, like, in the free world. And so it's never easy. Everyone's up every 2 years there. But the good news is we're continuing to push, and we're continuing to increase our support in New Hampshire. And so that's a quick peek at kind of what's happening in the legislative department. On the state legislative side, we've talked about what's going on in the federal legislative side, and we'll continue to bring you updates on that. And so it's a privilege to chat with you about the work that we're doing here on both fronts. And it's only because of the support of folks like you that support the National Right to Work Committee that we're able to do this, and not only protect worker rights in those states where we have it, but try to expand worker rights across the country. So, John, it's great to have you, and continue up your hard work and keep your team motivated as we get through this legislative session that will end in I guess another couple of months. Basically, it'll kind of die down to a point where it's manageable again. But thanks for your efforts, and we'll look forward to another report from you on the state legislative department and what's happening across the country in the weeks ahead. So thank you, John.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, okay.